can you go country by country? I mean, just take us on a tour through the region. What it would mean to take advantage, just at a high level, what it would mean country by country to take advantage of this moment.
Yeah. So I think first it's worth realizing that kind of the dynamics in the region as a whole are traditionally kind of shaped by three axes. There's the Shia axis of Iran and its proxies. There's the Sunni Islamist axis, the Muslim Brotherhood axis, which has a Turkey component and obviously Hamas and others. And then there's what you might call the Sunni pragmatist component, the Gulf states, Egypt and Jordan to a certain extent. And for those purposes, Israel is kind of a Jewish Sunni country, right? It's the Jewish Sunni pragmatist country, right? And what you're seeing in the region, I think, is a major setback for the Shia axis and a kind of moving to the foreground of the rivalry between the Sunni Islamist and the Sunni pragmatic forces. And that's going to play out in some places. The most prominent that we're seeing at the moment is in Syria, where a lot of questions as to the direction Syria is going. But it potentially raises challenges for Jordan, potentially raises challenges obviously in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. Where is it going? So if we go kind of broadly speaking, if you're thinking about Israel's opportunities, the way in which there is a shared opportunity for the US and Israel to shape a Middle East that is more stable and more prosperous and more secure, we begin with the Iran challenge, right? Which is obviously going to be a huge issue, both for setting the stage, as I described, that kind of reverse Afghanistan moment, and also for enabling the Middle East to move away from that conflict. And there, as you can see, a real dilemma is between the diplomatic economic approach, a kinetic approach, the combination of credible threat and sanctions and negotiations and how to navigate that. A lot more complex, I think, than people acknowledge, those set of decisions. There are some indications where the Trump administration may be headed, but I don't want to get ahead of that. But that is one component, of course. The second huge component is the issue of Saudi normalization, which we've talked about before, but essentially Saudi normalization is a way in which to legitimize in an Islamic sense coexistence with Israel and the acceptance of the Jewish people as part of the Middle East, which they are, but it's a kind of counter-narrative to the Iranian narrative, and what that normalization may unleash in terms of potential, both on the economic side and on the security side, right? How can we translate the kind of cooperation we had, for example, dealing with the Iranian missile challenge, into something more concrete? You know, people talk about the Israeli-Arab NATO or something. I don't know if we're going to get that quickly, but the role of CENTCOM and the way in which we can use that to create a really shared, interoperable alliance.
Which we started to see versions of in April of last year when Israel was responding to the Iranian attack, where really and a lot of that did flow through CENTCOM for the first time.
Yeah, and the capacity to concretize that is very important, but also the incredible opportunity we have from an economic perspective to create trade routes. And we know under the Biden administration, there was discussion of the IMEC corridor, which connecting kind of Asia, the Middle East and Europe, and using essentially, and I know it sounds ambitious and difficult to talk about for some, and I think Israeli society here is not yet there in its mindset, but there is a pathway to imagine the kind of end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the elements of, the Arab-Israeli conflict. If I had 30 seconds with President Trump, I think he's already there, but the foundations were built with the Abraham Accords. We have a chance to build a palace now, right? Maybe put the Trump name on top of that palace. Yeah. But essentially to create conditions for those who are not just aligned with the US, but committed to a Middle East that is based on stability to dictate. There is a huge challenge, I think, on the Palestinian issue, which we can talk about because it feels like a place where there is a significant gap. And the path to a day after in Gaza, for example, or the path to a normalization with Saudi Arabia involves resolving differences about how Israelis feel about the challenge of moving progress on the Palestinian issue to the way we often hear from the West or from some other countries.
So then where does the issue of the Palestinians fit into that? Because there are some who would argue that Israel has to move beyond quote unquote dealing with the Palestinians, not move in concert with a plan to address the Palestinians. Just move beyond it. The history's passed the Palestinians by, and October 7th demonstrated it, and so there's no more dealing with the Palestinians. And others argue you can't really move on in all these wonderful directions of opportunity and paths to opportunity without dealing with the Palestinian issue.
Yeah.
Whatever dealing with the Palestinian issue means, by the way.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're at a moment now, and I think also it may change and there are different dynamics, but we're at a moment now where I think at the kind of practical policy level, there is a question about the Palestinian component on the Saudi normalization deal. There is a question about how we get to a day after in Gaza without addressing a kind of vision for the Palestinian future, which is important, I think, for a lot of our partners. And of course, there's the challenge of how do we make sure that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is more stable. So there's the policy level of this, but there's also, I think, the moral question of what is our obligation to moving towards peace, to encouraging both Jewish and Palestinian self-determination without it being a suicide pact. And here I think it's important to point to a gap that we're going to have to think about very carefully. We know how important saying a commitment to Palestinian statehood is for many, many actors, right? But just because we know how important it is doesn't mean that it's easy for us to say it, right? Doesn't mean that it's easy to give expression to that. Because for most Israelis, following October 7th especially, talking about Palestinian statehood sounds like you're talking about creating the conditions for October 7th to happen again, or you're rewarding Hamas. To some extent, beyond that even, to talk about that the response to what happened in October 7th is Palestinian statehood tells a story about the conflict that most Israelis think is not the way to understand this conflict. It doesn't explain the genocidal threat that we face. It doesn't explain why statehood was rejected. It doesn't explain why there wasn't the issue of Palestinian statehood when Egypt and Jordan controlled the West Bank and Gaza. And it ignores the fact that there has been this constant rejection of Jewish self-determination in any boundary as a core part of the conflict. So we're kind of in that place where articulating a vision for the future is not only hard because we're traumatized, it's hard because it feels like to many Israelis, you're being asked to create the conditions for it to happen again. But for lots of other countries in the West and in the Gulf, I think as well, and those who are looking for us to offer a hopeful vision for the future, Palestinian statehood is a way of saying you're still committed to peace. You're committed to Palestinians living in dignity, having self-determination, being able to govern themselves.